If you enjoy my calm storytelling, I'd appreciate a subscription, a like, or a comment, all at your own pace. And now sit back. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you just want to unwind a little. Today, I'll tell you about surviving the Little Ice Age without central heating. In the 17th century, courtship wasn't about finding the one by swiping through faces on a screen. Instead, it was a deeply structured and highly regulated social process, rooted in tradition, religious values, and the preservation of family honor. While the idea of marrying for love wasn't entirely foreign, it certainly wasn't the default. Marriage was, above all, a strategic alliance. How matches were often orchestrated by families, especially among the middle and upper classes, where wealth, inheritance, and social standing played dominant roles. Parents acted as de facto matchmakers, consulting with clergy, community elders, or even professional intermediaries to ensure their children were paired with suitable partners. In rural communities, local gossip networks and family connections often facilitated unions, while in cities, guilds and professional associations sometimes helped orchestrate advantageous marriages within trade circles. Where did people meet? Opportunities to encounter potential partners were limited, but ritualized. Church attendance was not only a spiritual duty, but also a social one. Sunday services doubled as one of the few moments when unmarried individuals could glimpse one another in public. Festivals, market days, harvest celebrations, and saints' feast days were other rare occasions where interactions could happen under the watchful eyes of chaperones. These interactions were subtle. A prolonged glance across the pews, a respectful bow, or the accidental dropping of a handkerchief could all serve as cautious signals of interest. These minor gestures carried significant weight in a time where direct conversation between unmarried individuals was often forbidden or heavily supervised. The role of letters and go-betweens if a match seemed promising. The next step wasn't a date, it was negotiation. Families began communicating to discuss the financial and social compatibility of the match. Dowries, inheritances, land rights, and even the potential for shared livestock could all come into play. In Protestant regions, particularly in Northern Europe, there was a slow shift toward valuing the couple's personal consent, but even then, economic logic often trumped personal feelings. When direct contact wasn't possible, messages were delivered via trusted intermediaries. Letters sealed with wax and written in careful, sometimes coded language were the 17th century version of texting. A younger sibling, a neighbor, or a family servant might be tasked with passing along a note or a reply. These letters, while restrained by the norms of the time, sometimes offered glimpses of affection, wit, and even resistance to family pressure. Courtship was public, but feelings were private, unlike today's individualistic approach to love. Courtship in the 1600s was fundamentally a community matter. In many villages, the entire town might know that courtship was underway. The couple's behavior was closely watched. Any sign of impropriety could bring shame not just to them, but to their entire families. Yet even in these strict environments, love could grow. A shared moment during a harvest dance, a secret note slipped between prayer books, or a knowing smile across the market square could kindle real emotion. In rare cases, couples would defy their families and elope, though such actions often led to social and economic consequences. Marriage the end goal, not the beginning. Unlike modern relationships where love often precedes commitment, in the 1600s, marriage was frequently the starting point. Emotional intimacy, when it developed, did so after the legal and social contract had already been sealed. And while some marriages were loveless, many evolved into deep partnerships shaped by shared struggle, children, and the rhythm of daily survival. So, was there love? Yes, but it looked different. It was quieter, slower, more deliberate. It had to navigate strict rules, public scrutiny, and rigid gender roles. And yet, in stolen glances, careful words, and quietly exchanged vows, people still found ways to connect. In that sense, the desire that fuels modern apps, connection, recognition, the hope of being seen and chosen, was as alive in the 1600s as it is today. The methods have changed. The longing hasn't. As the 1600s progressed, particularly in Europe's Protestant North and Catholic South, courtship remained a controlled dance, governed not by the desires of individuals, but by the customs of family, faith, and community. Yet beneath this formal structure, a slow evolution was occurring. Ideas about affection, compatibility, and personal happiness began to surface more clearly in certain pockets of society. The practical mechanics of flirting courtship rituals varied by region, but shared a universal feature: public visibility. In places like England, Germany, and the Low Countries, group activities such as bundling, harvest dances, or village feasts served as socially accepted platforms for interaction. Bundling, for example, involved a young man and woman lying in bed fully clothed, sometimes with a board between them, while speaking through the night under supervision. It was meant to foster conversation, not intimacy, but obviously, it carried its own risks. In France or Spain, young women were often kept under stricter watch. Conversations occurred only under the gaze of an elder. The art of indirect communication through fans, gestures, or even embroidery became a powerful skill. Objects as signals. An age before instant messaging, lovers or would-be lovers relied on physical objects to communicate unspoken feelings. A ribbon exchanged at a fair, a sprig of rosemary tucked into a prayer book, or a personalized token like a coin, a carved comb, or a lock of hair could carry as much emotional weight as a modern message thread. Even clothing choices played a role. A certain color sash worn to church, a specific embroidery pattern on a sleeve, or the condition of a bonnet could act as silent announcements of interest or availability. The legal side of love marriage was not only a social and emotional arrangement, but also a legal contract. Canon law in Catholic regions and civil codes in Protestant ones required public declarations known as bans before a marriage could take place. These announcements were posted or read aloud in church 3 weeks in a row, giving the community time to raise objections. Age of consent laws existed but were flexible. In many places, girls could marry at 12 and boys at 14, though most marriages happened later, particularly in Northern Europe, where economic independence was often a prerequisite. In England, for example, average marriage age hovered around 24 for women and 26 for men, older than modern stereotypes might suggest. Dowries, contracts, and inheritance documents were carefully negotiated, often in the presence of witnesses and scribes. Marriage wasn't a casual decision, it was a public statement with real financial and social consequences. Songs, stories, and cultural influence, literature and ballads, shaped people's ideas of love even in the most rigid societies. The 1600s saw the rise of printed chapbooks and broadsheets filled with tales of star-crossed lovers, warnings against betrayal, and sometimes bawdy humor. These narratives influenced how young people thought about love, offering both cautionary tales and romantic ideals. The stories of figures like Romeo and Juliet, popularized through translations and traveling players, filtered into everyday consciousness, not as models to emulate, but as emotionally charged symbols of what love could cost. Meanwhile, religious literature emphasized virtue, duty, and chastity, creating a cultural tension between romantic longing and moral restraint. Courtship in urban versus rural settings. City life provided slightly more opportunities for anonymous interaction. Markets, apprenticeships, and guild events brought young people together more frequently. Inns, public squares, and even city walls became informal meeting places, though social hierarchies still dictated who could associate with whom. In rural settings, the village structure meant that everyone knew everyone. Reputation was everything. Rumors could travel faster than any horse. Yet, paradoxically, rural courtship could sometimes be more flexible, especially when overseen by smaller communities where personal relationships mattered more than rigid social rank. Resistance and autonomy. Not everyone followed the rules. There were elopements, secret handfastings, temporary or unofficial marriages, and informal unions based on cohabitation or pregnancy. In some Protestant regions, cohabitation itself could be recognized as a form of marriage if it was public and enduring, though often with limited legal rights. Women, while largely constrained, found ways to assert influence. Some refused matches, citing religious conviction or personal dissatisfaction. Others maneuvered through dowry negotiations to secure more favorable conditions. Even silence or delay could be used as a form of subtle protest. Despite the outward formalities and societal constraints, People in the 1600s experienced love and longing with a depth that often goes unnoticed in historical accounts. The emotional landscape of courtship was shaped by a complex interplay of religion, social expectation, and personal desire. Religious influence on emotional expression in Europe's deeply Christian societies. Love was often framed within the moral teachings of the Church. Affection was ideally tempered by virtue, patience, and self-control. Passionate displays were discouraged, especially for women, who were expected to embody modesty and chastity. However, this did not mean feelings were absent. Rather, they were internalized or expressed through subtle, socially acceptable means. Poetry and hymnody often served as safe outlets for emotions. Manuscript collections and printed verse books circulated in homes featuring verses about unrequited love, longing, and divine affection. The metaphor of courtly love, originating in medieval chivalry, persisted, blending spiritual devotion with earthly desire. Memory and ritual. Cementing emotional bonds. Memory played a crucial role in fostering attachment. Shared rituals, such as attending church together, participating in seasonal festivals, or exchanging gifts, were not just social customs but emotionally binding acts. Remembering the gift of a handkerchief for a particular meeting became part of the narrative couples carried forward, especially in an era without photographs. Physical objects took on emotional significance as mementos. Locks of hair tied with ribbons, embroidered tokens, or pressed flowers became tangible evidence of affection, enabling lovers to maintain a sense of closeness even when separated by distance. The pace of emotional development relationships in the 1600s unfolded slowly, partly due to practical constraints, distance, social supervision, and communication delays, and partly due to cultural norms valuing deliberation over haste. Months or even years might pass between initial interest and formal betrothal. This gradual pace allowed feelings to deepen quietly, but also left room for doubt, second thoughts, or pressure from families. It was common for feelings to fluctuate, especially as external factors like economic shifts or illness intervened. Gender dynamics and emotional labor. Emotional expression was gendered. Men were often expected to initiate courtship and demonstrate honor through gifts or public commitment. Women, while less publicly assertive, engaged in emotional labor behind the scenes, navigating family expectations, managing correspondence, and interpreting subtle social cues. Despite restrictions, women's voices and choices mattered. In some Protestant areas, couples could refuse arranged matches, relying on local magistrates or clergy to mediate disputes. Correspondence reveals women expressing joy, frustration, and even humor, challenging assumptions about passivity. The hidden power of courtship letters. Letters were far more than dry negotiations. They were spaces for emotional exchange, coded language, and sometimes rebellion. Writers used metaphors, biblical references, and poetic flourishes to convey feelings safely. The act of writing and receiving letters itself created anticipation, intimacy, and a sense of personal connection. For many, letters were the closest experience to modern dating communication. They allowed individuals to present their personalities, test compatibility, and build trust over time. Endurance and legacy. The endurance of these courtship practices helped shape Western concepts of love and marriage in subsequent centuries. Ideas about romantic choice, personal happiness, and emotional intimacy gradually gained cultural ground. But their roots lie deeply embedded in these early rituals and social codes. Once a couple had officially come together, whether through arranged means or quiet mutual consent, they entered another complex phase, both private and public: marriage itself and its far-reaching social consequences. Marriage as a social institution. In the 17th century, marriage was more than a personal bond. It was a cornerstone of social order. Marriages connected not just individuals, but families, economic interests, and political alliances. Especially among the wealthy and urban populations, marriage was a key tool for securing property, status, and social stability. Fulfilling marital duties, managing the household, raising children, and joint economic work was paramount. Romantic love was often secondary, but gradually became recognized as an important, if not always primary, element. Social control and gossip. Village communities, or urban neighborhoods closely observed newlyweds. The social fabric was tightly woven, and mistakes or infidelities were not just personal failings, but could bring shame upon entire families. Rumors, whispers, and public reproach were powerful mechanisms of social control. Spouses had to conform to social norms to maintain reputation and economic security. Family expansion and inheritance procreation was a central purpose of marriage. Children were not only emotionally desired but necessary to continue family names, inherit property, and preserve social standing. Given the high child mortality rates, each birth was a significant event. Inheritance and property matters often led to complex negotiations, especially in noble or wealthy families. Marriages served to forge alliances, and assets were carefully passed down to safeguard family lines. Separation and divorce when marriages failed. Options for separation were limited, particularly in Catholic regions where marriage was a sacrament and divorce forbidden. Protestant areas were somewhat more permissive, allowing divorce mainly for adultery or abandonment. However, separations remained socially stigmatized and could lead to economic ruin. For pragmatic reasons, many couples remained legally married even after love had faded. Legacy on concepts of love. The experiences and expectations of the 1600s laid the groundwork for later societal changes. While the Enlightenment and modernity increasingly emphasized the individual and personal feelings, many old rituals and ideas remained influential for a long time. Romantic love, as we understand it today, slowly emerged from a web of social duty, religious ideals, and personal longing, a process only beginning to visibly shift in the 17th century. The 1600s were far from uniform across Europe and beyond. Customs, laws, and social norms about love and marriage varied widely depending on geography, religion, class, and local culture. Northern Europe, Protestant shifts and economic realities in countries like England, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany and Scandinavia. The Protestant Reformation influenced courtship and marriage practices. Protestantism emphasized the consent of the couple more than Catholicism did, slowly shifting the balance of power in courtship negotiations. The rise of a burgeoning middle class, especially in trading cities like Amsterdam and Hamburg, introduced more personal choice in marriage. Still, financial considerations remained paramount. Apprenticeships, guild memberships, and property ownership shaped who could marry whom. Dowries were common, but the concept of the bride's morning gift, a gift from the groom to the bride on the wedding day, meant to provide her financial security, became more prominent. Southern Europe. Catholic tradition and ritual in southern European regions, Spain, Italy, France. Catholicism's influence remained strong. Marriages were closely tied to church rituals and sacraments, and the concept of marriage as an unbreakable spiritual bond was deeply entrenched. Families often arranged matches to consolidate land holdings or noble titles, and dowries could be substantial. Social rituals were elaborate, including formal engagements, promesse de mariage, pre-wedding religious blessings, and large communal celebrations. In some Mediterranean cultures, honor and family reputation governed behavior heavily, with courtship practices closely monitored by elders and neighbors. Eastern Europe and rural traditions in more rural or less centralized areas like Poland, Hungary, or Russia. Customs blended local folk traditions with Christian rituals. Wedding festivities could last several days and involve community-wide participation. Courtship here often included unique cultural elements such as singing contests, gift exchanges involving traditional crafts, or symbolic acts like the breaking of bread to signify union. Colonial and non-European contexts. While this story focuses primarily on Europe, it's important to note that in the 1600s, different continents had vastly different marriage customs. For instance, among indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, marriage often involved communal decision-making, clan alliances, and varied ceremonies. European colonists brought their customs abroad, but cultural exchange and adaptation created hybrid practices, especially in port cities and colonial settlements. Famous love stories and cultural icons. Though anonymous, everyday courtship is our main focus. The 17th century also produced some widely known love stories, both real and fictional, that influenced popular imagination. The tragic tale of Petrarch and Lara remained a touchstone for idealized, unrequited love. Literary works by Shakespeare, who died in 1616, shaped perceptions of romance and tragedy. French salon culture in the later 1600s began to explore love as a game of wit and conversation, planting seeds for later romantic ideals. Looking back at how love and courtship unfolded in the 1600s, it's clear that while the trappings were vastly different from today's world of swipes and instant messages, the human desire for connection, affection, and partnership was just as profound. Slow beginnings in a fast-paced world in an era without smartphones or social media. Courtship was slow, deliberate, and deeply embedded in social and religious frameworks. Every gesture, every exchange token, every church announcement carried weight. The ritualized process, sometimes cumbersome to modern eyes, ensured community involvement and accountability, reducing the chances of impulsive decisions. Today's dating culture may prize spontaneity and personal freedom, but the 17th century model reminds us that relationships have long been social contracts as much as emotional journeys. The balance between individual desire and communal expectation shaped not just marriage but entire societies. The roots of romantic love, modern romantic love, and centered on mutual affection, emotional intimacy, and personal choice, did not spring forth fully formed. It evolved from layers of tradition, religion, social control, and personal longing woven together across centuries. The 1600s planted important seeds. The notion that affection mattered alongside duty, that emotional bonds could coexist with social contracts. Letters and tokens created private spaces for love to flourish within public frameworks. Communication and symbolism, from fan language to embroidered ribbons to love letters filled with poetic code. Early modern lovers found creative ways to express themselves under watchful eyes. This tradition of symbolic communication continues today, albeit in new forms. Texts, emojis, memes, showing a timeless human ingenuity in expressing desire safely and playfully. Social and legal frameworks then, and now legal and religious strictures, shaped who could marry and under what circumstances, echoing into contemporary debates about marriage laws and social norms. The 17th century's insistence on community approval and public announcement contrasts with today's focus on privacy but shares a common goal: to protect individuals and families. The enduring human story, ultimately, the story of love in the 1600s, is a reminder that while technologies, fashions, and social structures change, the core human experience of seeking connection remains. Whether through a handwritten letter by candlelight or a swipe on a smartphone screen, people have always found ways to reach out and say, "I see you. I want to know you." Once a marriage was secured through ritual, family approval, or personal persistence, the lived reality of love unfolded in the quiet, repetitive rhythm of daily life. Far from the dramatic flourishes of romantic literature, love in the 1600s was often a process of building trust, managing hardship, and crafting intimacy out of duty, habit, and small gestures. Love in the structure of the household. A household was the primary unit of economic and emotional life. Married couples worked side by side, in workshops, on farms, in kitchens, and at marketplaces. The success of their household financially and socially depended on cooperation and mutual respect. There was little room for abstraction. Love was made visible through labor, protection, and provision. Acts like repairing a roof together, grinding grain, nursing a sick child, or sharing the last piece of bread carried emotional weight. These small daily acts often became the clearest expressions of love available in a world where language about emotion was constrained by custom and theology. Sex, intimacy, and the private realm. Physical intimacy was deeply influenced by religious norms. In many regions, the church viewed sex within marriage as both necessary and potentially sinful, if disconnected from procreation. Theologians debated the morality of desire even within wedlock. Passion was to be tempered by duty, yet many couples clearly shared more than obligation. Privacy, too, was limited. Houses were small, beds were shared with children or servants, and doors were thin. But even within these restrictions, couples found moments to be alone, to whisper, to touch, to connect. Love required improvisation. Pregnancy, childbirth, and emotional bonds. Pregnancy was constant. Without modern contraception, women might bear 10 or more children, often losing some in infancy. Each birth was both a hope and a risk. Childbirth itself was dangerous. Many women did not survive it. Despite the high mortality, parents loved fiercely, Letters, diaries, and funeral sermons revealed deep sorrow over lost children, pride in first steps, and joy in family rituals. The experience of raising children bound couples together and gave their relationship new emotional dimensions. Emotional suffering and silence, but not all marriages were warm. Abuse, neglect, and emotional isolation existed, and women had few avenues for escape. Legal records show petitions for separation, complaints about cruelty, and rare cases of women returning to their natal families. Yet even within unhappy unions, people coped. Some turned to religion, others to friendships, and many simply endured. The emotional landscape of the 1600s was marked not just by love's presence, but also by its absence and the silent strategies people used to survive it. Friendship, confidants, and secret attachments. In cases where romantic love was impossible or lost, emotional needs were often redirected. Deep same-sex friendships were common and socially accepted, sometimes expressing a level of intimacy that today might be read as romantic or queer. Letters between friends used a language of devotion, soul-binding, and loyalty that rivaled courtship letters. Some individuals formed lifelong attachments outside of marriage, in the form of secret loves, affairs, or enduring friendships. Though forbidden by law or church, these connections played real roles in people's emotional lives and sense of identity. Widowhood, remarriage, and love reborn death came early and often. Many people married more than once, not out of scandal, but survival. Widowhood gave some women a degree of independence they had never known as wives. A widowed man might remarry quickly to care for his children, but in second marriages, personal choice often played a greater role. There are records of widowers choosing brides based on affection, shared experience, or even admiration rather than wealth or alliance. In later life marriages, love could be more open, more equal, more emotionally expressive. These unions often defied the norms of youth-focused matchmaking. While most people's experiences with love were lived quietly in kitchens, fields, or narrow city street, the 17th century also saw a flourishing of artistic and literary expression that reshaped how love was perceived, discussed, and even pursued. The influence of literature on love, ideals, printed books, pamphlets, and chapbooks became more widely accessible across Europe, especially in urban centers. While literacy was still uneven, growing numbers of people encountered stories, religious, romantic, comedic, or tragic, that portrayed love in vivid and emotionally charged ways. Pastoral romances like La Arcadia or Daphnis and Chloe idealized innocent, rustic love set among shepherds and fields, an escapist fantasy for readers living in crowded cities or restrictive households. Courtly novels borrowed from medieval traditions, depicting noble love constrained by duty and honor. These stories glorified longing, secrecy, and sacrifice. In England, Shakespeare's influence lingered long after his death in 1616. His plays, still performed in public theaters, offered every shade of love, from tragic passion, Romeo and Juliet, to witty tension, Much Ado About Nothing, and even destructive obsession, Othello. Though fictional, these works did not remain locked in imagination. They helped people name emotions, recognize experiences, and dream of possibilities that their daily lives might not allow. Poetry and the private language of affection. Love poems were exchanged between lovers, written in journals or published in collections. These poems served as emotional outlets and coded declarations. Sonnets and verse letters allowed lovers to express devotion, grief, or desire in acceptable literary form. Writers like John Donne, with his metaphysical love poems, pushed the emotional and intellectual boundaries of romantic expression. In France, salon poetry began to blend cleverness with sensuality, laying the groundwork for Enlightenment-era flirtation and courtship based on wit rather than wealth. Music, song, and emotional memory songs were another medium through which love traveled. Ballads, often printed on single sheets, told stories of broken hearts, betrayal, secret meetings, and undying devotion. These were sung in taverns, fields, kitchens, and streets. A common practice was for lovers to gift each other with songs written or selected just for them, turning shared melodies into emotional anchors. Certain tunes came to represent specific memories, A first glance, a farewell, a letter received after a long silence. Music preserved feeling in a time when emotions had few safe outlets, and for the illiterate, it was the primary way to engage with romantic ideas. Painting and symbolic imagery portraiture became increasingly popular among the middle and upper classes during the 1600s. While formal in tone, these paintings often contained subtle romantic messages: flowers, clasped hands, distant gazes meant to convey affection or union. In Dutch genre painting, scenes of everyday life sometimes included quiet allusions to courtship: a young woman sewing as a man looks on a couple, sharing wine by candlelight, a servant smirking at their hidden gestures. Such visual clues reminded viewers that love existed even in modest domestic spaces, not just in castles or poetry books. The early rise of the individual heart culturally. The 17th century was a transitional era. The Renaissance had awakened a new interest in individual experience, and the coming Enlightenment would soon push reason, autonomy, and personal liberty to the fore. In between, people began to think more consciously about the inner emotional life, the self as a vessel for feelings like love, sorrow, and longing. Diaries, spiritual memoirs, and personal correspondence from the time show a growing awareness of individual emotion as something distinct, meaningful, and worth expressing. The 17th century was not only an age of ritual and reflection, it was also an age of catastrophe. Across Europe and beyond, people lived under the shadow of war, famine, and disease. These pressures didn't erase love, they intensified it, altered its expressions, and made each connection more fragile and more precious. The 30 Years' War disrupted love from 1618 to 1648. Central Europe was ravaged by the 30 Years' War, a brutal, chaotic conflict involving religion, territory, and power struggle. The war left towns destroyed, populations scattered, and economies in ruins. Marriage patterns shifted. In devastated regions of Germany and Bohemia, populations shrank so severely that many women were left without prospects. In some areas, the traditional age of marriage rose. In others, people rushed into unions out of fear and necessity. War separated lovers for years. Some soldiers never returned. Others did, broken and silent. For those who waited, letters became lifelines if they could write. In some families, women assumed male roles in households and businesses, altering gender dynamics within marriage for generations. Plague, death, and the urgency of affection. The 17th century saw repeated waves of plague and epidemic disease. Entire neighborhoods in cities like London, Venice, or Prague were emptied overnight. Death came quickly, indiscriminately, and often without goodbye. This proximity to mortality made love feel urgent, sometimes reckless. People formed attachments in a matter of weeks, not years. Secret marriages and rushed baptisms surged in plague-struck towns. Forbidden relationships were more likely to be risked. Kisses meant more when tomorrow wasn't promised. Some couples faced death together, nursing one another, burying children, fleeing cities. Others were separated by quarantines, never to see one another again. Love letters from plague times were full of trembling hope, deep regret, and prayers written in shaky hands. The emotional toll of survivors carried deep emotional scars. Grief became a companion. In the aftermath of war or epidemic, entire generations had to rebuild not just homes but families. Widows and orphans were everywhere. Love became both a symbol of resilience and a reminder of loss. Many turned to faith, others to superstition. Love charms, prayer scrolls, and amulets were exchanged not just for attraction, but for protection. Some people refused to remarry after losing a partner, preserving emotional memory like sacred relics. The resilience of love despite these traumas, or perhaps because of them, love in the 1600s was also marked by extraordinary tenderness. Affection was often spoken more freely in letters written during wartime than in peace. Marriages forged in hardship were described as stronger than steel. Lovers clung to each other not only as partners, but as proof that life still held meaning. In every account, written or oral, poetic or pragmatic, what emerges is not despair, but determination, a refusal to let darkness have the last word. People still met, married, raised children, and carved moments of joy into the margins of crisis. The experience of love in the 17th century was not one size fits all. a noblewoman in a French chateau, a city-dwelling tradesman, and a peasant girl in a remote village all navigated romance under entirely different constraints. Class didn't just influence what kind of marriage one could make, it defined the entire structure around how, when, and even if one could fall in love. Nobility love as politics, love as power among the aristocracy. Marriage was never merely personal. It was strategy, diplomacy, and inheritance all rolled into one. Marriages were arranged not by affection, but by calculated alliance. Titles, lands, dowries, bloodlines all carried more weight than character or compatibility. Young nobles were often betrothed as children. Some never even spoke to their future spouse before the wedding. These unions could involve estates spread across borders, and negotiations could take years. Love, if it came at all, was often a lucky afterthought. Still, affection existed behind palace walls. Letters between married nobles show tenderness, sometimes shy, sometimes passionate, especially when the couple found shared respect or endured hardship together. But private love could never be allowed to disrupt public duty. Scandal was costly. Some nobles, especially women, sought emotional intimacy outside their marriages. Affairs were common, especially in court cultures like Versailles, where seduction and intrigue were part of daily life, but discretion was everything. Merchants and tradespeople, practicality meets emotion in Europe's growing towns and cities. The emerging middle class lived between worlds, still bound by family expectations, but increasingly influenced by personal agency and urban culture. Marriages among merchants, artisans, and guild families were partly arranged and partly chosen. Parents still played a strong role, but young people had more opportunities to meet in markets, workshops, or church societies. For these couples, compatibility mattered not only emotional, but economic. A spouse needed to be trustworthy, industrious, and capable of managing a household or business. Love was often practical before it was poetic, yet this practicality laid fertile ground for respect to grow into genuine affection. These were the couples who often wrote each other letters during business trips, exchanged tokens at fairs, and built emotional partnerships over time, brick by brick, budget by budget. Peasants and rural laborers, community, reputation, and survival in the countryside. Love was shaped by proximity. Villages were small, social roles fixed, and everyone knew everyone else. Marriage was vital for survival. Farms needed heirs, fields needed hands, and every winter was a gamble. Courtship was deeply intertwined with local custom. Dances, seasonal festivals, and communal work brought young people together, but always under the eyes of the community. Reputation was everything. A misstep could lead to exclusion, especially for women. Here, love was rarely grand, but often sincere. Young people might marry someone they'd known their entire life. Shared labor, shared hardships, and a shared fate created bonds that romantic fiction rarely captured. Still, romance found its way. Folk songs and oral tales told of secret trysts in fields, midnight meetings by barns, and lovers who defied parental orders. Peasants didn't have portraits or love sonnets, but they had bonfires, cider, and starlit evenings, and that sometimes was enough. Secret longings, queer love, and forbidden desire in the 17th century, though. The 1600s offered few safe spaces for same-sex love or relationships outside of marriage. These connections were real, persistent, and often deeply emotional. They existed between the lines of sermons, beneath the ink of formal letters, and behind closed doors. While the language of identity like gay or bisexual didn't yet exist, love and desire between people of the same gender, emotional, romantic, sexual, did. And despite the risks, people found each other. Same-sex friendships or something more. In this era, intimate same-sex friendships were common and often celebrated, especially among men. These friendships were emotional, sometimes physical, and regularly expressed through letter writing, poetry, and shared time. Men wrote to each other with language modern readers might interpret as romantic. I am ever yours, and miss your breath beside mine each cold morning. Woman too, shared beds, held hands in public, and sometimes lived together, especially widows or unmarried companions. While not all these bonds were sexual, many clearly transcended conventional friendship. The ambiguity of such relationships gave them both cover and complexity. Society allowed certain intimacy as long as it didn't name itself. This ambiguity became a survival strategy. Codes, risk, and punishment. The homosexual acts, especially between men, were criminalized in many parts of Europe. Punishments ranged from imprisonment and public shaming to execution. In England, the Buggery Act had been law since 1533. In Catholic regions, the Inquisition could investigate accusations of sodomy. As a result, queer individuals developed coded ways of expressing interest and affection. They used poetry, gesture, clothing signals, and trusted intermediaries. Love letters might refer to mythological figures, literary couples, or astrological metaphors. Some found refuge in subcultures, especially in cities like Amsterdam, Venice, or Istanbul, where port life and anonymity allowed more freedom. But the fear of exposure never disappeared. Cross-dressing and gender nonconformity. The 17th century also saw numerous cases of individuals who lived in gender roles different from those assigned at birth. Some women dressed as men to access education, work, or freedom, and sometimes to live with female partners as brothers or soldiers. There are court records of such individuals being discovered, sometimes punished, sometimes quietly let go. Their existence challenges our assumptions about gender rigidity in the past. Love and identity often hid in plain sight. Some were remembered in folklore as tricksters, saints, or sinners. Others vanished from the record altogether. But their footprints suggest courage and longing that defied every law of their time. Emotional legacy. Though queer love in the 1600s was rarely named, it persisted. It left traces in poems, trial transcripts, religious confessions, and folk tales. Behind those traces were real people, aching, hoping, terrified, and tender. They loved despite silence. They navigated desire within danger, and their stories, part visible, part erased, are a powerful reminder that love has always been more complex than society's narrow boxes. Divine desires. Love a spiritual experience. In the 17th century and the 1600s, love wasn't always seen as secular or earthly. For many, love was sacred, a reflection of divine order, a path to God, or a temptation from the devil. Emotional and romantic experiences were often filtered through religious belief, mystical vision, or philosophical theory. Religious interpretations of love. Christian Europe, still deeply influenced by medieval theology, saw God as the highest object of love. Human relationships were understood as reflections or distortions of divine love. Marriage, for instance, was framed as a holy sacrament, a symbolic union mirroring Christ and the Church. Love between spouses was supposed to be rooted in faith, humility, and mutual salvation, not just affection or desire. At the same time, desire, especially physical, was treated with suspicion. Passionate love could be seen as a temptation or sin unless it was disciplined by marriage and purpose. Sermons warned of carnal love leading to spiritual ruin, but not all religious voices agreed. Some argued that true love, even between humans, could elevate the soul toward God. The writings of Saint Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, though from the late 1500s, still influenced mystics and poets well into the 1600s. Their language blurred the line between divine ecstasy and human longing. Mystical and occult views on love and attraction in secretive circles of natural philosophers, alchemists, and mystics. Love wasn't just emotional, it was a cosmic force. Some believed that everything in the universe was governed by sympathy, and attraction planets influenced people. Stones held powers, and love could bend fate. These ideas came from Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and Kabbalistic thought, which remained popular in certain elite and underground circles. Texts like Giordano Bruno's cosmological works, though he was executed in 1600, proposed that love was a magnetic energy connecting all things. Astrology flourished, with horoscopes used to predict compatibility, marriage success, or romantic timing. In love spells and charms, herbs were chosen not just for their smell or use, but for their planetary associations. Rose for Venus, rosemary for memory, thyme for courage. These weren't just folk beliefs, they were part of a larger vision where emotion and matter were intertwined. Philosophical shifts toward psychology. The late 1600s. Some thinkers began to question religious and mystical framework. The early Enlightenment sowed the seeds of a psychological understanding of love. Philosophers like René Descartes started examining emotions' passions as natural processes, not divine gifts or demonic tricks. In his 1649 work, The Passions of the Soul, he suggested that love was a mental movement toward something we perceived as good, an idea that would echo into modern psychology. These ideas didn't yet reach the average person, but they marked the beginning of a shift from love as divine mystery to love as natural phenomenon. From heaven to heart, love as a bridge between worlds across these worldviews. Christian, mystical, philosophical love remained a mystery. Whether it came from God, the stars, or the nerves, it was something that moved people beyond themselves. It inspired poems and prayers. It caused sleepless nights and religious revelations. It threatened order and promised transformation. And for many in the 1600s, love was not just a feeling, it was an invitation to see the world differently. Love on the brink of change, from tradition to enlightenment, late 1600s. 17th century drew to a close. Subtle but significant transformations began to ripple through European societies. Reason started to challenge religion. Individual feeling began to compete with duty, and public conversation about private emotion expanded in books, salons, and letters. The world was not yet modern, but it was beginning to bend in that direction. The rise of the novel and emotional imagination of the most powerful forces in reshaping love was literary. The emergence of the modern novel. Earlier in the century, romantic tales were largely aristocratic fantasies, knights, chivalry, courtly ladies. But by the late 1600s, writers in France, England, and elsewhere began experimenting with realistic emotional storytelling. Books like Aphra Bain's Oroonoko, 1688, or Madame de Lafayette's La Princesse de Clèves, 1678, explored inner emotional lives. Characters had doubts, longings, and moral conflicts. Readers were invited to feel with them, to cry, to hope, to reflect. These novels didn't just entertain, they helped people rehearse emotional depth. They gave language to feelings that might otherwise remain private or inexpressible. The age of the love letter, with increased literacy, especially among the upper and middle classes, came a boom in personal correspondence. The 17th century had already seen love letters between spouses and suitors, but by the 1680s and 90s, the genre matured. Letter writing became almost an art form. Manuals were published on how to write elegant or persuasive love letters. In some circles, exchanging letters was even more intimate than touch. It allowed for vulnerability, thoughtfulness, and sustained emotional connection over distance. Many couples wrote dozens, even hundreds of letters. Some used metaphor and symbol, others were bluntly honest. These preserved emotions show a growing sense that love was not just duty or fortune, but feeling, and that feeling could be expressed, even preserved. Marriage begins to shift the seeds of consent, though. Arranged marriages remained dominant, especially among elites. By the late 1600s, the idea of mutual consent began to gain traction, especially in Protestant regions and among the middle classes. Legal thinkers and moralists began to argue that a marriage made without the willing agreement of both parties lacked moral foundation. This didn't mean romantic love had replaced family strategy, but it meant affection was no longer irrelevant. In some cities, young people eloped to avoid forced matches. In others, church authorities quietly accepted clandestine marriages as long as they were freely entered. This shift laid the groundwork for 18th century transformations, love marriages, companionate ideals, and even the eventual rise of divorce as a legal concept. Reason meets emotion. A new debate begins finally, as Enlightenment thought took shape. Led by thinkers like Locke, Spinoza, and Leibniz, the question of emotion became philosophical. Was love irrational? Was it natural? Was it dangerous? Could it be explained? Some thinkers saw love as a noble passion, evidence of the soul's ability to transcend selfishness. Others viewed it as a trick of biology or instinct, something that needed to be managed by reason. These debates foreshadowed modern psychology, but they also influenced ordinary people. In salons, coffee houses, and homes, love was no longer just something to feel, it was something to debate. Conclusion: a mirror of transition. B. 1700. Love in Europe had not been liberated, but it had changed. It still wore the robes of religion, the chains of duty, and the rituals of class, but it had also discovered its voice in novels, letters, philosophy, and rebellion. People had begun to imagine love as something personal, emotional, expressive, something that could be talked about, even chosen. And that imagination, however limited, however fragile, was powerful. It would shape the emotional revolutions of the 18th century and echo into our modern myths of love. From sacred bond to soulmate, the legacy of 17th century love in the Enlightenment, the 18th century didn't begin from scratch. It inherited deep tensions from the 1600s between reason and passion, duty and desire, tradition and personal freedom. These tensions would fuel an era of revolution, not just political, but emotional. The Enlightenment's famous questions, what is freedom? What is the self? What is happiness? Were applied not just to kings and parliaments, but to hearts and homes. The birth of romantic love as an ideal, the emotional vocabulary developed in the 1600s through novels, letters, poems, and spiritual writings blossomed into a full cultural force by the mid-1700s. Love was no longer just one part of life. For many, it became life's highest purpose, the path to happiness, even the essence of personal identity. This was a major shift. In the past, people hoped love might emerge in marriage. Now, many wanted love to precede marriage, not just affection, but a deep inner connection, a shared soul, a mirror of the self. Writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau gave voice to this idea, arguing that love revealed authentic feeling in a world full of artificial rules. His novels, especially Julie or The New Heloise 1761, helped spread the notion that true love should be emotional, natural, and morally, elevating a view that would shape modern romance for centuries. Philosophers, feminists, and emotional autonomy at the same time, Enlightenment thinkers took seriously the question, who gets to choose whom to love? This led to new arguments about freedom, equality, and gender. In France and England, early feminists like Mary Estelle and later Mary Wollstonecraft critiqued the way women were married off as property. They argued that love without autonomy was not love at all, but coercion. This was radical. It planted seeds for modern views of mutual respect and consent in relationships. It also laid groundwork for the idea that being in love should involve emotional and intellectual partnership, not just biology or family alliance. The romantic tragedy takes shape. The elevation of love came with a darker side, the idea that love could be so powerful, so necessary, that life without it felt meaningless. This led to a surge in tragic love stories, often in literature, but sometimes reflected in real life. Lovers who couldn't marry due to class, religion, or parental pressure were idealized. Some died for love, literally or metaphorically. The pain of unfulfilled love was no longer just unfortunate, it was portrayed as noble, beautiful, even necessary to feel truly alive. This dramatic intensity would define Romanticism in the 19th century, but its roots lay in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Writing becomes emotional memory as personal diaries, memoirs, and autobiographical novels became more common. People began to record their own emotional histories. Love was no longer just something you did, it was something you reflected on, wrote about, shaped into narrative. This turn toward introspection marked a revolution in emotional self-awareness. It contributed to what historians call the emotionalization of the self, a gradual process through which people saw feelings not as fleeting whims, but as core components of identity. Continuity and change. Of course, not everyone changed overnight. In rural areas, marriage remained a family decision. Class boundaries stayed firm. Queer relationships stayed hidden or criminalized. But in cities, among writers, merchants, intellectuals, and eventually revolutionaries, love was transformed. The quiet, coded longings of the 1600s had become a public conversation. And that conversation would continue to evolve through Romanticism, realism, psychology, and into the modern world. Final thought, love as inheritance. The love we talk about today, the kind we text, post, fear, crave, and chase, is not new. It is a historical inheritance, shaped by centuries of stories, rules, revolts, and yearnings. The people of the 1600s lit candles in cathedrals, scratched poems into letters, glanced across market stalls, and whispered in plague wards, not knowing that their longing would still echo in ours. In their world so different, so distant, Tinder didn't exist. but the impulse to seek connection, to make meaning out of another's presence, to write the soul into words, that impulse is timeless. A Day in the Life of Love, 1600s edition. No matter the era, love doesn't just live in philosophy or literature. It unfolds in ordinary moments. Here's a glimpse into how affection, longing, courtship, and commitment played out in the rhythms of daily life during the 17th century. Morning glances, gossip, and good timing in many small towns. The morning market was a hot spot for casual interaction. While officially about buying bread or eggs, the market was a place where unmarried people could see one another, often the only public space where casual glances were socially tolerated. But nothing stayed secret for long. A prolonged gaze, a shared joke, or even standing too close near the well might start rumors. In some regions, entire courtships were conducted under the watchful eyes of neighbors, mothers, or church elders. In larger cities like Amsterdam or Paris, coffee houses and bookshops provided slightly more anonymity. Young literate men and women might pass notes or flirt through shared readings of poetry or philosophy, subtly feeling out intellectual and emotional compatibility. Afternoon letters, ribbons, and secret meetings be midday. In households with education and privilege, letter writing began. Lovers, especially those separated by distance, family objections, or status, relied on handwritten correspondence. Letters were poetic, symbolic, and filled with religious metaphors, allegories, or inside jokes. Writers often used flowers, wax seals, and folded paper tricks to communicate feeling. Some even included tokens of affection: a ribbon, a pressed flower, or a lock of hair. Deliveries were made through trusted friends, household servants, or in more daring cases, smuggled during errands or church visits. For the less literate, affection might be shown through gifts or gestures, making something by hand, giving part of a meal, or helping with a task in the field or workshop. These acts were deeply personal and often coded with meaning. Evening church bands, singing, and silent lunginga as the day wound down. Evening gatherings created space for public steps toward courtship. In Protestant regions, church services might read out the banns, a public notice that a couple intended to marry. It was both a declaration and a test. Anyone could object. In villages, evening might bring communal activities: singing, weaving circles, storytelling, or seasonal festivals. These events made day dances, harvest feasts, or St. John's Eve bonfires allowed semi-permitted closeness under the excuse of tradition. Still, physical affection was rare in public. Lovers might sneak a moment behind a barn or whisper during a group walk. In places like Scotland or Scandinavia, supervised bundling was sometimes allowed, where a couple shared a bed with clothes on, to talk intimately without crossing physical boundaries. But for many, longing remained silent. Love was felt in the pause before a word, the touch of a hand during prayer, or the ache after a fleeting glance. Love beyond Europe, global glimpses. While this story has centered on Europe, it's worth noting that the 1600s were a deeply global century. Contact, colonization, trade, and travel brought emotional exchange too. In Japan, during the Edo period, love was expressed through poetry and seasonal metaphors, especially among the urban merchant classes. The floating world of entertainment and beauty allowed for romantic storytelling outside rigid family duty. In Mughal India, courtly love flourished in poetry and painting. The ghazal tradition explored longing, distance, and divine emotion, often blurring earthly and spiritual love. In West Africa, oral traditions and symbolic gifts shaped matchmaking, while praise poetry was used to express admiration or desire. These different emotional systems show that love is universal, but never uniform. Culture, belief, and language shaped how it was lived, and what risks it carried. The threads of love woven daily by the time candles were snuffed out and beds creaked under coarse linen. Love still lingered, in unspoken thoughts, in imagined futures, in the space between expectation and reality. Even without modern language for crushes, soulmates, or relationship status, people felt deeply. They waited, they hoped, they wrote, they suffered, they celebrated, and they carried their feelings, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Love in the margins, queerness, and nonconformity in the 16th to 17th century was a time when social and religious institutions strongly enforced strict gender roles and heterosexual marriage as the only acceptable form of union. Laws against same-sex acts were harsh and punishable by imprisonment, exile, or even death in many parts of Europe and its colonies. Yet, despite these risks, queer love and non-binary relationships persisted, lived through coded language, secret networks, and private rituals. Coded communication and hidden communities, because open expressions of queer love could lead to persecution. People developed subtle ways to connect and communicate. Literature and poetry, some poets embedded queer longing in their work through metaphor and allegory. The language of friendship or devotion could carry double meanings understood only by those in the know. Social gatherings, taverns, coffee houses, and certain artistic circles sometimes served as clandestine meeting places. Here, gestures, looks, and coded phrases allowed for secret recognition. Symbols and tokens, certain colors, flowers, or jewelry styles might signal identity or availability without attracting public attention. Non-conforming lives and identities, while modern categories like gay, lesbian, or transgender didn't exist, individuals whose feelings or gender expressions diverged from norms found ways to live authentically, at least in pockets. Some chose disguise or cross-dressing to pursue love or freedom, often inspired by theater traditions or practical needs. Women dressed as men to serve in armies or to attend university, creating space for relationships otherwise impossible. Others lived in close same-sex partnerships, sometimes known as companions or romantic friends. These relationships might be emotional, physical, or both, and were sometimes tolerated if discreet. There are records of gender variance and fluidity in some indigenous cultures globally, recognized within their communities even if misunderstood or suppressed by colonial powers. Risk, resistance, and survival. The 1600s were dangerous for those who openly defied sexual or gender norms. Courts prosecuted sodomy, witchcraft, or heresy with brutal penalties. Fear was a constant shadow, yet resistance took many forms. Legal advocacy was rare, but existed in some places, as lawyers and sympathizers tried to defend accused individuals. Cultural resistance through art, coded stories, and oral traditions preserved alternative histories of love and identity. Community solidarity formed underground, creating networks of support and protection. Legacy of hidden love, though often erased from dominant historical narratives, queer love in the 1600s shaped cultural memory and emotional history. It reminds us that love is not confined by law or norm, but finds expression wherever humans seek connection. The quiet influence of forbidden love on culture and society, though hidden from mainstream view, queer emotional experiences found expression through various cultural forms, leaving a lasting impact on the creative and intellectual currents of the time. Literature between the lines writers often used coded language and allegory to explore themes of same-sex desire and nonconformity without attracting censorship. Poets like Richard Crashaw and Amelia Lanier embedded nuanced expressions of affection that could be read as platonic or romantic, depending on the audience. In theatrical circles, plays sometimes included subtextual references to same-sex attraction or gender fluidity, offering rare glimpses into alternative emotional worlds. These coded texts created safe spaces for emotional exploration and community identification, passing down fragments of queer experience through generations. Theater and performance. The vibrant theater scenes of England, France, and Italy played with gender and desire in complex ways. All male acting companies, such as those in Shakespeare's England, naturally involved men playing female roles, allowing female roles. Explorations of gender identity and desire within the performance. Court entertainments and masquerades embraced disguise and fluid identity, blurring lines between public and private selves. Such performances offered audiences a space to experience and reflect on non-normative love in a socially sanctioned but imaginative context. Visual arts and symbol-length paintings, engravings, and illustrated manuscripts sometimes included symbolic representations of intimacy and affection that transcended strict heteronormative narratives. Certain motifs like intertwined hands, flowers, or gazes carried layered meanings, often intelligible only to those within close social circles. Portraits of companions or pairs sometimes conceal deeper emotional bonds behind formal poses. Social change and intellectual currents. While open advocacy for queer rights was non-existent, the early Enlightenment emphasis on reason, individual rights, and personal freedom planted seeds for future challenges to sexual and gender norms. Philosophers began questioning traditional authority and societal structures, setting intellectual foundations that would eventually support more inclusive views of identity and love. Underground networks and sympathetic allies nurtured a slow but persistent movement toward recognition and dignity. The enduring echo, though the 1600s were often harsh for those whose love defied norms. The emotional truths lived in private and shared quietly across time. These hidden histories remind us that love's complexity is a constant, even when shadowed by fear and silence. Romanticism and the rise of the emotional self 1750 to 1850, while Enlightenment thinkers focused on reason, structure, and universal laws, the Romantics rebelled. To them, feeling not logic was the heart of being human, and nothing expressed that better than love. Love as sacred suffering. Romanticism didn't treat love as polite affection or marital duty. Instead, it elevated it to something spiritual, tragic, and all-consuming. Love became a kind of holy madness, something that could save you or destroy you. Novels, poetry, music, and art of this era were soaked in longing, heartbreak, and idealism. Think of Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, 1774, in which unrequited love leads to suicide. Byron's poetry, filled with doomed passions and tortured heroes. Beethoven's letters to his mysterious, immortal beloved. These works captured the era's obsession with the depth and drama of emotion, especially romantic desire. The expansion of the personal narrative with the rise of literacy and print culture. More people began to write about love from their own perspective. Memoirs and autobiographies shared intimate confessions. Diaries and letters became emotional lifelines. Women's voices, though still constrained, began to appear more frequently in print, revealing their interior lives, hopes, and emotional intelligence. This personalization of love helped shape modern ideas of the self as something unique, emotional, and deserving of fulfillment. The romantic defense of queer longing, though homosexuality was still criminalized and stigmatized. The Romantic movement's celebration of emotional intensity gave queer writers and artists new ways to express themselves. Romantic friendships, deep, emotionally intense relationships between people of the same sex, became socially acceptable, even celebrated. Some of these friendships were, in fact, romantic or sexual relationships hidden in plain sight. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft, Walt Whitman, and Emily Dickinson expressed same-sex affection in ways that blended emotional honesty with poetic ambiguity. Romanticism gave space, however limited, for non-normative love to be seen as beautiful, profound, and human. Companionate marriage and emotional partnership, the idea of marrying for love, not wealth or alliance, gained serious ground. The companionate marriage emerged a partnership between equals based on affection, mutual respect, and shared life goals. Middle-class ideals of domestic harmony began to replace older patriarchal models of control and obedience. This didn't eliminate inequality, but it marked a major emotional shift, especially in how love and marriage were discussed in books, sermons, and society. The tragic side of feeling romanticism also made room for love's darker elements: jealousy, obsession, despair. In literature, this was reflected in themes of madness, death, and doomed passion. Emotion was not something to be controlled, but embraced even when it destroyed the self. This darker romantic vision influenced everything from Gothic novels to opera, and eventually shaped modern pop culture's love for heartbreak stories. Love in the 1600s, emotional survival in a controlled world, while outward customs were shaped by religion, law, and family hierarchy. The inner emotional lives of people in the 1600s remained deep, complex, and often at odds with public norms. Hidden correspondence and secret letters. In a time when public behavior was strictly monitored, private letters became a critical outlet for emotional expression. especially in matters of forbidden or socially unapproved love. Lovers often used ciphered writing, invisible ink, or even coded metaphors, hiding romantic meaning behind discussions of nature, virtue, or poetry. A common phrase like "your rose blooms still in my garden" might secretly reference undying affection, a meeting place, or a shared memory. These letters were carefully hidden within book bindings, sewn into clothing, or entrusted to loyal messengers, as discovery could lead to ruin or scandal. Letter writing became not just communication, but an act of emotional resistance in a world that demanded obedience and silence. The power of the Church and confession. The Church, in both Catholic and Protestant contexts, held enormous influence over the structure of relationships. Confessionals served both as places of spiritual cleansing and, in some cases, as a form of emotional release where forbidden feelings were whispered into darkness. For some, the act of confession offered the only legal space to speak of their desires, even if those desires were condemned. Sermons regularly warned of carnal temptation, urging the faithful to resist passions seen as sinful, yet their very intensity revealed how widespread such emotions were. The line between sin and sentiment was constantly negotiated in people's minds, creating internal conflict that echoed across diaries and devotional writings. Emotional intimacy beyond romance. Not all love in the 1600s was romantic or erotic. In fact, some of the most powerful emotional bonds were found in friendships, siblings, and servant-master dynamics. Letters between close friends could be profoundly intimate, expressing longing, admiration, and even jealousy, emotions often indistinguishable from romantic love. In households, servants and family members often became emotional confidants. In the absence of privacy, these relationships absorbed daily tension and offered moments of connection. In some cases, these non-romantic bonds were the most stable, long-lasting emotional anchors in a person's life. These ties showed that emotional life in the 1600s was multidimensional, not confined to marriage or sexual love. Music, poetry, and subtle protest art became a covert expression of emotional rebellion. Lute songs, madrigals, and ballads, sung in court or village taverns, often carried emotional truths behind metaphors of nature, dreams, or myth. Poets used classical references like tales of Narcissus, Orpheus, or Sappho to explore themes of longing, identity, or non-conforming love. Even public festivals, with their masks and dances, offered moments of temporary freedom, where people could speak, touch, or choose, if only for one night. These cultural spaces allowed emotional truth to slip through the cracks of rigid social structures. Restrictions, repression, and quiet resilience. Despite these expressions, the 1600s remained a time of emotional control. Families arranged marriages to secure land, status, and alliances. Love was a luxury, not a right. People who failed to conform, those who never married, loved incorrectly, or sought freedom, were often isolated, punished, or labeled mad. And yet diaries, marginalia, and hidden letters show that many refused to surrender their feelings, even when silence was safer. The emotional world of the 1600s was a constant balancing act between what was allowed and what was felt. Love across borders, class, rank, and the limits of desire. In the 1600s, in the early modern world, love was rarely a matter of free choice. A person's birth, their class, religion, and region shaped not only who they could marry, but how and whether they could express desire at all. Village love, practical, quiet, enduring. In peasant communities, love was deeply tied to labor, property, and survival. Marriage wasn't just emotional, it was a contract involving fields, tools, livestock, and social status. Matches were often arranged after harvest seasons or at religious festivals, with families aiming for security, not romance. But even within these constraints, many couples developed deep, quiet bonds built not on courtship, but on shared hardship and daily closeness. Love in rural life may have lacked luxury, but it offered a kind of resilience and intimacy born of routine. Noble love, beautiful, controlled, and dangerous. Among the nobility, love became a performance of power, and alliance marriages were tools for forging political ties, often arranged before partners had even met. Yet behind the formalities, the noble world hosted a hidden culture of flirtation and coded desire through symbolic gifts, poetic letters, or suggestive dances at masked balls. Affairs happened, but discretion was law, especially for women, who risked ruin with any exposure. In noble circles, love was often elegant in appearance, but emotionally risky and tightly choreographed. Love magic and folk rituals in both villages and towns. Many turned to folk beliefs and magical practices. When love seemed out of reach, people used herbs, charms, amulets, and even bodily items like hair to attract affection or bind a lover. Common practices included whispering spells under the moon, carving initials into trees, or slipping a potion into food. Such acts, while widespread, were risky. Under the wrong circumstances, they could be labeled witchcraft, especially if a relationship turned sour or crossed class lines. Still, love magic reflected a desperate hope that feelings could be shaped, fate could be bent, and connection could be conjured even in a world full of barriers. Religious boundaries and moral enforcement churches wielded immense power over how love was lived. Premarital intimacy, adultery, and non-heteronormative relationships were condemned not just spiritually, but legally. Public punishment could include confession before the congregation, fines, shaming rituals, or in rare cases, imprisonment. At the same time, the rich and powerful often evaded such penalties, their sins quietly overlooked if their influence held. Religious doctrine was both a moral compass and a means of social control, guiding not only behavior, but internal feelings of guilt, shame, or desire. Secret spaces and stolen moments despite the constraints. People found ways to nurture emotional closeness. Lovers met in fields, forests, stables, mills, and churches, using the rhythms of daily life to carve out time together. A passing glance at the market, a brief touch during communal work, a murmured phrase while fetching water, these moments became deeply meaningful, even if brief. Physical space mattered. Even a shadowed stairwell or a candlelit side chapel could become a sanctuary for unspoken affection. Love in the 1600s was not loud. It whispered. It hid. It endured in the stewardly in-between spaces, surviving under layers of expectation and fear.